Welcome, dear traveler through time. Tonight, we journey to ancient Egypt, to the golden shores of Alexandria, to walk alongside one of history's most extraordinary women, a woman whose intelligence captivated emperors, whose beauty became legend, whose name echoes through the centuries. Close your eyes now and let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of the day dissolving like morning mist over the Nile. Tonight, you need not think or plan or worry. Tonight, you simply listen and drift into peaceful rest. We are going to meet Cleopatra VII, last pharaoh of Egypt, last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a woman who spoke 9 languages, who studied at the greatest library the world has ever known, who ruled one of the richest kingdoms on earth. This is not just a story of beauty or seduction, though those played their parts. This is a story of intelligence and courage, of political genius and profound learning, of a woman who stood equal to the most powerful men of her age. But do not concern yourself with remembering every detail. Let the story wash over you, like gentle waves, lapping at Alexandria's shore. Let it carry you deeper and deeper into rest. Take a deep breath now. Let it out slowly. With each breath, you sink a little further into comfort, into warmth, into peace. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to accomplish. Simply rest here, in this moment, as we travel together to the banks of the Nile, to a palace where golden light spills across marble floors, where the Mediterranean breeze carries the scent of lotus flowers and papyrus reeds. Alexandria, in the 1st century before Christ, was the jewel of the ancient world. Founded by Alexander the Great 3 centuries earlier, it had grown into a city of perhaps 500,000 souls, the largest in the Mediterranean, rivaling even Rome itself. The city sprawled along the coast, its famous lighthouse, the Pharos, rising nearly 400 feet into the air, guiding ships from across the known world into its harbors. The streets were laid out in a perfect grid, wide avenues lined with colonnades, temples to both Greek and Egyptian gods standing side by side, markets filled with goods from India and Africa, from Arabia and the Black Sea. But the crown jewel of Alexandria was its library, the Great Library, the museum, where scholars from every land gathered to study, to debate, to preserve the knowledge of the ancient world. Here were hundreds of thousands of scrolls, perhaps as many as 700,000, containing the wisdom of Egypt and Greece, of Persia and Babylon, treatises on mathematics and astronomy, philosophy and medicine, poetry and history. To walk through its halls was to walk through the accumulated learning of human civilization. It was in this city, in the year 69 before Christ, that a girl was born who would one day sit upon the throne of the pharaohs. Her name was Cleopatra Philopator, which means Cleopatra, beloved of her father. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals who had claimed Egypt after the great conqueror's death. For 300 years, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt, adopting the titles and customs of the pharaohs, while remaining fundamentally Greek in language and culture. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy XII, called Auletes, the flute player, a weak and unpopular king who clung to power through bribes paid to Rome. Her mother's identity is uncertain, lost to history, though she was likely a woman of the Egyptian royal court. Cleopatra had several siblings, sisters and brothers, who would later become both allies and rivals in the endless struggle for power that characterized the Ptolemaic court. But on the night of her birth, as oil lamps flickered in the palace chambers, as priests made offerings to Isis and to Serapis. None could have known that this infant girl would become the last of her line, the final pharaoh of an Egypt that stretched back 3,000 years into the mists of time. None could have known that her name would be remembered when all others were forgotten, that poets and playwrights would tell her story for millennia to come. Let us watch as the infant grows into a child, as the child becomes a young woman. The palace where Cleopatra spent her youth was a place of both splendor and danger, of gilded halls and whispered conspiracies. The Ptolemies were not a gentle family. Brothers murdered brothers for the throne. Sisters poisoned sisters. Mothers killed their sons. It was a court where survival required constant vigilance, where trust was a luxury few could afford. But young Cleopatra had one great advantage, one gift that would serve her throughout her life. An extraordinary mind. From her earliest years, she showed a hunger for knowledge that was remarkable even in a court that prided itself on learning. While other royal children played with toys and servants, Cleopatra sat in the library, surrounded by scrolls, absorbing knowledge like a sponge draws water. She learned languages with astonishing ease. Greek was her native tongue, the language of the Ptolemaic court, but she mastered Egyptian, becoming the first of her family in 300 years to speak the language of the people she ruled. She learned Latin, the language of Rome, that rising power to the west that cast an ever-growing shadow over Egypt. She studied Aramaic and Hebrew, the languages of the Levant. She learned the tongues of the Ethiopians and the Medes, of the Syrians and the Arabians. Ancient sources tell us she could converse with foreign ambassadors in their own languages, without need for translators, a skill that gave her tremendous advantage in diplomatic negotiations. But languages were only the beginning. She studied mathematics and geometry, following in the footsteps of Euclid, who had taught in Alexandria centuries before. She learned astronomy, studying the movements of the stars and planets, understanding the calendar and the seasons. She read philosophy, the great works of Plato and Aristotle, learning the art of logical argument and reasoned debate. She studied medicine and natural history, learning the properties of plants and minerals, knowledge that would serve her well in managing the vast agricultural wealth of Egypt. History was perhaps her favorite subject. She read the chronicles of the pharaohs, learning of Hatshepsut and Thutmose, of Ramses and Akhenaten. She studied the conquest of Alexander, understanding how one man with vision and courage could change the world. She read about Rome, that city on 7 hills that had grown from a small republic into the dominant power of the Mediterranean, learning its history, its political system, its strengths and weaknesses. This knowledge would prove invaluable when she later dealt with Caesar and Antony, for she understood Rome in ways that few foreigners ever did. She was taught the art of rhetoric, the ability to speak persuasively, to sway audiences with words alone. Ancient sources speak of the pleasure of her conversation, not just her beauty, but her intelligence, her wit, the charm of her discourse. She learned music, playing the lyre and singing in a voice that was sweet and clear. She studied the arts of grace and poise, learning to move like a queen, to command attention simply by entering a room. But life in the palace was not all books and learning. Cleopatra also learned the harder lessons of power politics. She watched as her father struggled to maintain his throne, borrowing vast sums from Roman money lenders to bribe Roman politicians. She saw how Egypt's independence was slipping away, how Rome increasingly treated Egypt as a client state rather than an independent kingdom. She learned that in politics, there were no permanent allies, only permanent interests. When Cleopatra was about 12 years old, her father was driven from the throne by his own subjects, who were tired of his weakness and his endless taxation to pay Roman bribes. Ptolemy Auletes fled to Rome, seeking help from the Senate. For months, Cleopatra and her siblings lived in uncertainty, not knowing if their father would return, whether they themselves might be killed by whoever seized power. It was a formative experience, teaching the young princess that power was fragile, that today's ruler could be tomorrow's exile, that survival required not just intelligence, but flexibility, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Her father did return, restored to his throne by Roman soldiers, but he never forgot who had saved him. In his will, he placed Egypt under Roman protection, making the Republic the guarantor of the Ptolemaic succession. It was an admission of weakness, a recognition that Egypt could no longer stand alone. But it also gave Cleopatra an idea, a strategy that would shape her entire reign. If Egypt could not be independent, perhaps it could bind itself to Rome through personal ties, through loyalty not to the Senate, but to individual Roman leaders who might value Egypt as an ally rather than a conquest. Ptolemy Auletes died in 51 BC, when Cleopatra was 18 years old. In his will, he left the throne jointly to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10 years old. They were to marry, as was the Ptolemaic custom. Brothers and sisters wed to keep power within the family. They were to rule together as co-monarchs. But everyone knew that Cleopatra would be the true ruler. She was older, far more intelligent, already experienced in the ways of court politics. Her brother was a child, easily manipulated by the powerful men who served as his advisors. Cleopatra was crowned pharaoh in the ancient capital of Memphis, in the Temple of Ptah, with all the traditional ceremonies that reached back to the beginning of Egyptian civilization. She wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. She held the crook and flail, symbols of royal authority. She became, in the eyes of her Egyptian subjects, the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, mother of Egypt, protector of her people. It was a role she would take seriously, identifying herself with the goddess, using Isis's symbolism to strengthen her own position. But even as she took the throne, clouds were gathering on the horizon. Rome was tearing itself apart in civil war. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies, were now enemies, their armies clashing across the Mediterranean. Egypt, wealthy and strategically positioned, would inevitably be drawn into this conflict. And in Alexandria, Cleopatra's brother's advisors were plotting against her, determined to remove her from power and rule through the boy king they could control. The young queen would need all her intelligence, all her courage, all her skill at political maneuvering simply to survive. The great drama of her life was about to begin. The first year of Cleopatra's reign showed her strength and her vision. She took her role seriously, not content merely to sit in the palace and enjoy luxury. She traveled through Egypt, showing herself to her people, making offerings at temples, observing the annual flooding of the Nile that brought life to the land. She issued decrees in both Greek and Egyptian, one of the few Ptolemaic rulers who cared enough to communicate with her subjects in their own language. But trouble was brewing in the palace. Her brother's advisors, particularly a cunning eunuch named Pothinus, who served as regent, and a general named Achillas, who commanded the royal army, resented taking orders from a woman. They began to undermine her authority, whispering that Egypt needed a strong male ruler, not a girl who spent her time reading books. They worked to turn the court against her, spreading rumors, buying loyalty with promises of power and gold. By the summer of 49 BC, the situation had become untenable. Cleopatra's name was removed from official documents. Coins were minted, showing only Ptolemy XIII, as if Cleopatra did not exist. Court officials who supported her were dismissed or worse. It became clear that she was in danger, that Pothinus and Achillas might decide that removing her permanently was simpler than merely sidelining her. Cleopatra made a difficult decision. She would leave Alexandria, leave Egypt itself if necessary, and go into exile. It was a calculated retreat, not surrender. She knew that if she stayed, she might be imprisoned or killed. But if she left, she could gather support, build an army, and return to claim what was rightfully hers. She had learned from her father's exile that sometimes the path back to power lay through temporary retreat. She fled east, into Syria, beyond the reach of her brother's soldiers. There, in the cities of the Levant, she began to gather support. She had gold, for she had been wise enough to take treasure with her. She had her name, for even in exile, she was still Cleopatra, legitimate heir to the throne. And she had her wits, her ability to persuade and negotiate, to forge alliances and make promises. She recruited mercenaries, tough men who cared nothing for Egyptian politics, but who would fight for gold. She made contact with local princes and chieftains, offering friendship and trade advantages if they would support her cause. Slowly, over months, she built an army. It was not large, but it was loyal, and it was hers. By the fall of 48 BC, she was ready to march back to Egypt, to fight for her throne. But then something happened that would change everything, that would alter the course of her life and of history itself. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. Caesar and Pompey's civil war had reached its climax. They had fought at Pharsalus in Greece, and Caesar had won a stunning victory. Pompey had fled, sailing east with what remained of his fleet, seeking refuge. He came to Egypt, hoping that the young Ptolemy XIII would grant him asylum, perhaps remembering that Pompey had helped restore Ptolemy XII to the throne years before. But Pothinus and Achillas made a cold calculation. Pompey was a loser now, defeated, on the run. Caesar was the victor, the future. If they helped Pompey, they would make an enemy of Caesar. But if they killed Pompey, perhaps Caesar would be grateful. Perhaps he would support Ptolemy XIII's sole rule and confirm the expulsion of Cleopatra. So they invited Pompey ashore, welcomed him with smiles and assurances, and then, as he stepped from his boat onto Egyptian soil, they murdered him, stabbing him in the back as his wife watched in horror from the ship. They cut off his head and presented it to Caesar when he arrived a few days later. Expecting thanks and alliance, Caesar wept when he saw Pompey's head. Pompey had been his enemy, yes, but also his son-in-law, married to Caesar's daughter Julia, who had died years before. He had been a great Roman, a consul, a general who had conquered the East. He deserved better than assassination by foreign courtiers. Caesar's reaction sent a clear message. Those who had killed Pompey had not won his favor. They had shown themselves to be dishonorable and treacherous. Caesar took up residence in the royal palace, declaring that as Rome's representative, he would mediate the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. He summoned both to appear before him. Ptolemy XIII came openly, surrounded by his advisors. But Cleopatra faced a problem. She was camped outside Alexandria with her small army. But if she marched into the city, she would likely be seized or killed by her brother's soldiers before she ever reached Caesar. The city gates were watched, the palace guarded. She needed to get to Caesar without her brother's men knowing she was coming. She needed to make an entrance that would be remembered, that would capture Caesar's attention and imagination. And so she devised one of the most famous stratagems in history. Picture the scene. Night has fallen over Alexandria. The palace is quiet, the guards at their posts. Caesar sits in his chambers, reading reports, dictating letters. The work of empire never ceasing even here at the edge of the known world. He is 52 years old, at the height of his powers. Conqueror of Gaul, master of Rome, the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. But he is tired. The civil war has taken its toll. And now he finds himself in this foreign palace, dealing with the petty squabbles of an Egyptian royal family. There is a knock at the door. A servant enters, announcing that a merchant has arrived with a gift for the great Caesar. A carpet from the finest workshops of Alexandria. Caesar, ever curious, tells them to bring it in. A large man enters, a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, carrying a rolled carpet on his shoulder. He lays it carefully on the floor before Caesar, and then, as Caesar watches with growing interest, the carpet begins to unroll, and from within it emerges a young woman, rising to her feet with grace and poise, shaking out her long dark hair, fixing Caesar with eyes that are intelligent, amused, and utterly fearless. "Greetings, Caesar," she says in perfect Latin, her voice rich and melodious. "I am Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and I have come to plead my case before you." It is a moment that will be remembered for millennia, retold in countless stories and plays and films. Whether it happened exactly this way, we cannot know for certain. Ancient sources differ in the details. Some say it was a carpet, others a large sack. But what matters is the essence of the story. Cleopatra's daring, her theatricality, her understanding that sometimes power comes not from armies, but from capturing imaginations. Caesar is immediately intrigued. This is not some trembling girl begging for help. This is a woman of intelligence and courage, who has just risked everything on a bold gamble. If she had been caught entering the palace, she would have been killed. But she came anyway, rolled in a carpet, trusting that her wit and charm would be enough to win Caesar's support. They talk through the night. Cleopatra speaks in Latin, demonstrating her mastery of Rome's language, showing that she understands Roman culture and politics. She makes her case with logic and eloquence. She is the rightful pharaoh, the elder, the more capable ruler. Her brother is a child, manipulated by evil advisors who murdered Pompey in violation of all laws of hospitality. Egypt needs a strong ruler who can work with Rome, not weak men who resort to assassination. But she does not simply appeal to justice or politics. She charms Caesar with her conversation, with her intelligence and wit. Ancient historians speak of the pleasure of her company, how she could converse on any subject, how her voice was like music, how her presence commanded attention. She is young enough to be his daughter, but she speaks to him as an equal, demonstrating a knowledge of history, philosophy, and politics that few Romans could match. And Caesar, worldly and experienced as he is, finds himself captivated. Here is something new, something he has not encountered in all his years of conquest and politics. A queen who is also a scholar, a woman who rules not just through birth, but through ability, a mind that matches his own. He is drawn to her intellect, yes, but also to her courage, her audacity, the sheer dramatic flair of her entrance. By morning, Caesar's mind is made up. He will support Cleopatra. He will force her brother to accept her as co-ruler, as their father's will required. But Pothinus and Achilles are not willing to accept this. They have invested too much in controlling the boy king. If Cleopatra returns to power, they are doomed. So they take a desperate gamble. They incite the people of Alexandria against Caesar, claiming that he is imposing foreign rule, that he has been seduced by Cleopatra's wiles, that Egypt is in danger of becoming a Roman province. Riots break out in the streets. Caesar and Cleopatra find themselves under siege in the palace, surrounded by hostile forces. What follows is known as the Alexandrine War, a months-long siege and urban battle. Caesar has only the few troops he brought with him, perhaps 4,000 men. The Egyptian royal army numbers 20,000. But Caesar is Caesar, one of the greatest military minds in history. He fortifies the palace district, controls the harbor with his ships, sends urgent messages to his allies, begging for reinforcements. The fighting is fierce, often hand-to-hand in the narrow streets of Alexandria. At one point, Caesar himself has to swim for his life when his position is overrun, holding important papers above the water with one hand. In the chaos, fire breaks out and spreads to the famous library. How much was destroyed, we do not know for certain, but the loss was catastrophic. Thousands of irreplaceable scrolls consumed by flames, knowledge lost forever. Through it all, Cleopatra remains at Caesar's side. She is no helpless princess waiting to be rescued. She uses her authority, her knowledge of Egyptian customs and language, to help manage the crisis. She communicates with loyalists in the city, gathers intelligence, helps coordinate strategy. She shows Caesar that she is not just beautiful and intelligent, but also brave, capable of enduring hardship, a true partner in adversity. Finally, after months of fighting, reinforcements arrive. Caesar's ally Mithridates arrives with an army from Syria. The royal forces are defeated in battle. Young Ptolemy XIII flees and drowns in the Nile, weighed down by his golden armor. Pothinus and Achilles are killed. The siege is lifted. Cleopatra is victorious. She is now sole ruler of Egypt, though Roman power ensures her throne. In accordance with tradition, she marries her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but he is even younger and less capable than the drowned Ptolemy XIII. Everyone knows who truly rules Egypt: Cleopatra, and Cleopatra alone. And her relationship with Caesar has deepened beyond politics. They have become lovers. The 52-year-old conqueror and the 21-year-old queen, bound together by mutual intelligence, by shared danger, by an attraction that is as much intellectual as physical. Ancient sources speak of their conversations, how they would talk for hours about philosophy and politics, about the nature of power and the fate of empires. With her throne secure, Cleopatra set about ruling Egypt with energy and intelligence. She was not content to be a figurehead. She involved herself in every aspect of governance, from agriculture to taxation, from religious ceremonies to foreign policy. She showed herself throughout Egypt, making offerings at temples, showing her face to her people, binding them to her through the ancient rituals of kingship. She was particularly devoted to the goddess Isis, identifying herself with the mother goddess, the protector of Egypt. This was politically astute. The worship of Isis was spreading throughout the Mediterranean world. By associating herself with the goddess, Cleopatra made herself not just a political ruler, but a religious figure, semi-divine, worthy of reverence and loyalty. In the summer of 47 BC, she gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but everyone called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar never formally acknowledged the boy as his son, but neither did he deny it. For Cleopatra, the child was invaluable. He was proof of her connection to Caesar, a living bond between Egypt and Rome, and he was her heir, continuing the Ptolemaic line. That same summer, she and Caesar took a legendary journey up the Nile. Caesar wanted to see Egypt, to understand this ancient land he had restored to its queen. Cleopatra organized a voyage that became the stuff of legend. They traveled on a magnificent barge, essentially a floating palace, gilded and perfumed, filled with every luxury. Ancient sources speak of 400 ships accompanying them, a floating city moving up the great river. They visited the ancient temples of Thebes and Memphis, saw the pyramids and the Sphinx, marveled at monuments that were already ancient when Alexander conquered Egypt. For Caesar, it was a reminder of the depth of history, of civilizations that had risen and fallen long before Rome was even founded. For Cleopatra, it was a demonstration of Egypt's wealth and glory, a subtle reminder that Egypt was not just another conquered province, but a proud kingdom with its own traditions and power. But Caesar could not linger in Egypt forever. Affairs in Rome demanded his return. The civil war was technically over, but there was still resistance in Africa, still opposition in Spain. Caesar had to leave, to continue the endless work of consolidating his power, of transforming Rome from a republic into something new, something that would one day be called an empire. He sailed west in the summer of 47 BC, leaving Cleopatra pregnant with his child, leaving Egypt still independent, but clearly under Roman influence. They would not see each other again for more than a year, not until Cleopatra made her own journey to Rome, a journey that would scandalize the Eternal City and cement her legend. In 46 BC, with all his enemies defeated, Caesar celebrated his triumphs in Rome. Those great parades where victorious generals displayed the wealth they had won and the captives they had taken. He was now dictator, the most powerful man in Rome, though he still maintained the fiction of the Republic, still held elections and consulted the Senate, even as everyone knew where true power lay. And then Cleopatra arrived. She came to Rome with great ceremony, bringing Caesarion, now about a year old, establishing herself in one of Caesar's villas across the Tiber. Her presence caused an immediate sensation. Romans were fascinated and scandalized in equal measure. A foreign queen, an Egyptian, living openly in Rome, clearly involved with Caesar, mother of his son. It was unprecedented, shocking, thrilling. She brought with her the luxury and sophistication of Alexandria. Romans who visited her villa spoke of marvels. Walls hung with priceless tapestries, floors of polished stone, furniture inlaid with ivory and gold, servants who moved silently and efficiently, exotic foods and wines. She held court like a queen, receiving Rome's elite, conversing brilliantly in their own language about philosophy and politics, art and literature. Caesar honored her with a golden statue placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the goddess from whom the Julian family claimed descent. This was extraordinary, placing a living person, and a foreign woman at that, in a Roman temple alongside the gods. It suggested something more than a simple political alliance, something that made Romans deeply uncomfortable. But what exactly was Cleopatra doing in Rome? Why risk the dangerous sea journey, bringing her infant son into a city that was suspicious of foreign influence? She was gambling that Caesar would formally acknowledge Caesarion, perhaps even make him his heir. She was gambling that her connection to Caesar would ensure Egypt's independence and prosperity. And perhaps she hoped for more, that Caesar might find a way to be with her permanently, to create some new political arrangement that would bind Rome and Egypt together under their joint rule. If this was her hope, she was to be disappointed. Caesar was busy with plans for new campaigns, reforms at home, the endless work of governing. He made time for Cleopatra, certainly. They continued their discussions, their conversations about philosophy and power, but he did not acknowledge Caesarion publicly. He did not make any move to change the fundamental relationship between Rome and Egypt. Cleopatra remained his lover. Her son remained unofficially his, but nothing more. And then, on the Ides of March, in 44 BC, everything changed. Caesar went to the Senate, and he never came back. 23 stab wounds, blood on the marble floor, the dictator dead, killed by men he had pardoned, men he had trusted, Brutus among them. When news reached Cleopatra in her villa across the Tiber, she must have known immediately that her position was now desperately dangerous. She was a foreigner, closely associated with a man who had just been murdered by those claiming to save the Republic. She had no legal status in Rome, no protection. A mob might turn against her at any moment. Her son, Caesar's son, could be seen as a threat by those now scrambling for power. She acted with characteristic decisiveness. Within days, perhaps within hours, she was making preparations to leave Rome. She gathered her household, her treasure, her attendants. She chartered ships, and as Rome descended into chaos, as Caesar's assassins fled and his supporters rallied, as Mark Antony delivered his famous funeral oration that turned the city against the conspirators, Cleopatra sailed away, heading home to Alexandria with her son, leaving behind the man she had loved, the father of her child, leaving behind the dreams of what might have been. The journey back to Egypt must have been filled with uncertainty and fear. What would happen now? Who would dominate Rome? Would the new rulers demand Egypt's submission, perhaps even invade? And what of her own position at home? She had been away for nearly 2 years. Her co-ruler, her brother Ptolemy XIV, was still in Alexandria. Would he try to seize sole power in her absence? She need not have worried about the last question. Shortly after her return, Ptolemy XIV died suddenly. Ancient sources hint at poison, and it is likely true. Cleopatra could not afford a rival. especially not now when everything was uncertain. She made her son Caesarion, not yet 3 years old, her co-ruler, giving him the throne name Ptolemy XV. She was now effectively sole ruler, with an infant co-monarch who would not threaten her authority. But the larger questions remained unanswered. Rome was in chaos, civil war brewing again between Caesar's assassins and his supporters. Egypt waited, watching, hoping that the storm would pass without engulfing the kingdom on the Nile. Cleopatra was 25 years old, a widow in all but name, mother of a child whose famous father was dead, ruler of a rich kingdom that was surrounded by danger on every side. She had survived exile, siege, and the assassination of her patron. Now she would need to find a way to navigate the new world that Caesar's death had created. Little did she know that she would find, in the chaos of Rome's civil war, another great Roman, another powerful man who would be drawn to her intelligence and charm. His name was Mark Antony, and his love for her would be both more passionate and more tragic than anything she had shared with Caesar. But that story, that great and terrible story, still lay in the future, waiting in the wings like an actor preparing for his entrance. For now, let us simply rest in this moment of uncertainty and transition. Let your breathing deepen. Let your body relax. You have journeyed through Cleopatra's early life. From princess to exile to queen, there is more to come. But for now, simply drift, simply rest, simply float on the gentle currents of sleep. 3 years passed. 3 years of civil war in Rome, of battles fought across the Mediterranean, of shifting alliances and betrayals. Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, had been defeated at Philippi by Caesar's heirs, Mark Antony, who had been Caesar's loyal lieutenant, and young Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son. The assassins were dead, but now the victors had to divide the Roman world between themselves. They met and made their arrangement. Octavian would take the west, including Rome itself and the troubled provinces of Gaul and Spain. Antony would take the east, the richer and more stable provinces of Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and everything beyond. It seemed like a fair division, but everyone knew that it could not last. Eventually, these two would come into conflict, and only one would emerge as master of Rome. Antony had much to do in the east. The region had been devastated by years of civil war. Armies had marched back and forth, requisitioning supplies, demanding tribute. Cities had been looted, farms burned. The people were exhausted and resentful. Antony needed to restore order, to collect taxes that would pay his legions, and to prepare for a possible campaign against Parthia, Rome's great rival on the eastern frontier. But first, there was the matter of Egypt. Rich, fertile Egypt, which had remained neutral in the civil wars, which had not sent help to either side, which had simply waited to see who would win. Antony needed Egypt's wealth, needed its grain, needed to ensure that Cleopatra would be a loyal ally. So he summoned her to meet him at Tarsus in Cilicia to answer questions about her loyalty. It was a command, not an invitation. Cleopatra was being called to account before Rome's representative in the East. She could have refused, could have stayed in Alexandria, and hoped that Antony would be too busy to press the matter. But that would have been short-sighted, dangerous even. Better to meet Antony, to explain herself, to forge an alliance as she had done with Caesar. And so Cleopatra decided to come to Tarsus. But she would not come as a suppliant, as an accused queen begging for mercy. No, she would come as Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, living goddess, equal to any man. She would make an entrance that Antony would never forget. In the late summer of 41 BC, Cleopatra sailed up the river Cydnus toward Tarsus. But this was no ordinary arrival. She came on a barge that was like something from a dream or a myth. The stern was covered in gold that glinted in the sunlight. The sails were purple, the color of royalty. Silver oars dipped rhythmically into the water, keeping time to music played by flutes and harps. The barge was perfumed, the scent of exotic spices drifting across the water, reaching the shore long before the vessel itself. And there, under a canopy of gold cloth, lay Cleopatra, dressed as the goddess Venus, or rather as Isis in her aspect as goddess of love. She was surrounded by attendants dressed as sea nymphs and cupids. It was theater, magnificent theater, deliberately invoking divine imagery, creating a spectacle that would be talked about for generations. Word spread through Tarsus. The Queen of Egypt was arriving, and she was coming like a goddess. People flocked to the riverbank to watch. They left the market square where Antony was sitting on his tribunal, waiting to dispense justice. Soon, Antony found himself sitting alone, abandoned by the crowds who had all rushed to see Cleopatra's arrival. Ancient writers tell us that wags in the crowd joked that Venus had come to feast with Bacchus for the good of Asia. It was a clever observation. Antony liked to compare himself to Bacchus, or Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry, the god of the good life. And here was Cleopatra, presenting herself as Venus, goddess of love. The implication was clear. Here were two divine beings, meeting as equals, ready to bring blessing to the lands they ruled. Antony sent messengers inviting Cleopatra to dinner. She declined politely, suggesting instead that he dine with her on her barge. It was a subtle but important reversal. Antony had summoned her as a Roman magistrate calling a client ruler to account. She was responding by inviting him as a queen, hosting a visiting dignitary. She was reframing the entire encounter. Antony accepted, perhaps amused by her audacity, perhaps already intrigued. That night, he boarded her barge and entered a world of luxury that surpassed anything he had ever experienced. The deck was strewn with flowers. Lights blazed from countless lamps. The banquet was sumptuous beyond description, with delicacies from every corner of the known world. And presiding over it all was Cleopatra, witty, charming, speaking to him in his own language, entertaining him with stories and conversation that kept him spellbound. Over the following nights, she entertained him again and again, each banquet more magnificent than the last. She made a game of it, challenging him to match her extravagance, always outdoing whatever he offered. But it was not just the spectacle that captivated Antony. It was Cleopatra herself, now 28 years old at the height of her powers. Ancient sources tell us her features were perhaps too strong for Greek ideals of beauty, but her presence was magnetic. Her voice was musical, her intelligence obvious, her wit sharp. She could converse on any subject, from philosophy to military strategy, from poetry to politics. She adapted herself to her companion, becoming whatever he needed. And Antony, for all his Roman pride, for all his power as master of the East, found himself falling under her spell. He was 42 years old, a military hero, a politician who had survived the deadliest intrigues of Roman civil war. But he had never met anyone quite like Cleopatra. He followed her back to Alexandria, abandoning his responsibilities, putting off his planned Parthian campaign, forgetting about Rome and Octavian and all his plans. He spent the winter of 41 to 40 BC in Alexandria. And it was a winter of extraordinary indulgence. Cleopatra and Antony formed a sort of club they called the Inimitable Livers. They lived for pleasure, for entertainment, for the joy of each day. They hunted and fished, gambled and drank, attended plays and banquets. It was a time out of time, a golden interval when the world's troubles seemed far away. Cleopatra was happy. After the danger and uncertainty of the past years, after Caesar's death and the chaos that followed, she had found not just a protector, but a partner. And in the late summer of 40 BC, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. She named them Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, Alexander the sun and Cleopatra the moon. The names were significant, harking back to Alexander the Great, suggesting that these children were destined for greatness, for rule over both East and West. But the world would not let them remain in their private paradise forever. Antony had responsibilities. His wife Fulvia, back in Rome, had started a war against Octavian. The war went badly. Fulvia died, leaving Antony free, but also politically embarrassed. He had to return west, to make peace with Octavian, to shore up his position. He left Alexandria in 40 BC and did not return for 4 years. During that time, he married Octavian's sister, Octavia, a political marriage designed to cement the alliance between the two men. Octavia was everything a Roman matron should be: modest, virtuous, dutiful. She bore Antony 2 daughters and managed his household with quiet efficiency. But Antony did not forget Egypt. He did not forget Cleopatra. And in 37 BC, when his marriage to Octavia was showing cracks, when his alliance with Octavian was growing strained, he summoned Cleopatra again, this time to Antioch in Syria. She came, bringing their 4-year-old twins. And this time, Antony acknowledged them formally as his children, giving them recognition in an official ceremony. He went further, showering Cleopatra with gifts of territory: parts of Lebanon, the Palestinian coast, cities in Syria, regions rich in timber and in balsam. Egypt's territory grew, its wealth increased. Cleopatra's kingdom was becoming an empire. In return, she promised support for Antony's Parthian campaign. Egyptian gold, Egyptian grain, Egyptian ships would back Roman legions in their attack on Parthia. It was a true alliance, each partner bringing strengths to support the other's goals. The Parthian campaign was a disaster. Antony led his army deep into Parthia, but supply lines were cut, discipline broke down, and the Parthians harassed the Romans with their famous mounted archers. Antony was forced to retreat through the Armenian highlands in winter, losing thousands of men to cold and starvation. It was his greatest military defeat, a humiliation that stained his reputation. He returned to Syria exhausted and depressed. Octavia, dutiful wife that she was, brought supplies and reinforcements from Italy, but Antony refused to see her. Instead, he sent word that she should return to Rome. He then traveled to Alexandria, back to Cleopatra, back to the city where he had been happiest. This was the final break. Everyone could see it now. Antony was choosing Cleopatra over his Roman wife, Egypt over Rome, the East over the West. Octavian began a propaganda campaign, painting Antony as a man who had abandoned Roman values, who had been bewitched by a foreign queen. But Antony did not care. In 34 BC, He celebrated a triumph not in Rome, but in Alexandria, parading his Armenian captives through Egyptian streets, sitting beside Cleopatra on golden thrones, presenting their children to the cheering crowds. This was unprecedented. Triumphs were Roman ceremonies, held in Rome. To hold one in Alexandria was to suggest that Alexandria was now the equal of Rome, perhaps even superior. And then came the donations of Alexandria, a ceremony that shocked the Roman world. Antony gathered the people and made a series of announcements. Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings. Caesarion was declared King of Kings and legitimate heir of Julius Caesar. The various territories of the East were divided among Cleopatra's children with Antony. Alexander Helios would rule over Armenia, Media, and Parthia. Cleopatra Selene would rule over Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus, a younger son, would rule over Syria and Asia Minor. It was spectacular theater, but it was also a political declaration. Antony was essentially creating an Eastern empire, with Cleopatra as its queen and himself as its guardian. The children's territories were mostly notional, but the intent was clear. The East would be united under Cleopatra's family, allied to Rome perhaps, but independent, powerful, a realm that could stand as an equal to Rome itself. In Rome, Octavian read the reports and smiled grimly. Antony had given him all the ammunition he needed. Octavian began preparing for war, not against Antony directly, but against Cleopatra. He would frame it as a war to save Rome from foreign domination, and by attacking Cleopatra, he would force Antony to defend her, to choose between Rome and Egypt. In 32 BC, Octavian obtained Antony's will, or claimed to have obtained it. He read it to the Senate. The will supposedly stated that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra, even if he died in Rome. This was presented as proof that Antony had abandoned Rome. The Senate voted to strip Antony of his powers and to declare war on Cleopatra, not on Antony, carefully, but on the foreign queen. It was a clever political move. Romans who might have hesitated to fight Antony had no such qualms about fighting an Egyptian queen. Antony and Cleopatra prepared for war. They gathered their forces in Greece, assembling an army of perhaps 70,000 men and a fleet of 500 ships. It was an enormous force, but there were problems. Many of Antony's Roman officers were uncomfortable. Some deserted to Octavian. Others counseled Antony to send Cleopatra back to Egypt, but Antony refused. He and Cleopatra would stand together. The decisive confrontation came on September 2nd, 31 BC, in the waters off Actium, a promontory on the western coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, faced Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces. It was to be a naval battle. The fate of the Mediterranean world decided on the waves. The battle began in the morning. Antony's larger ships, heavy quinqueremes and massive galleys, moved ponderously forward. Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron waited in reserve. Octavian's ships, lighter and more maneuverable, darted in and out, avoiding direct confrontation, trying to separate Antony's fleet, to divide and conquer. The fighting was fierce, but inconclusive. Antony's ships were powerful but slow. Octavian's were fast, but too light to seriously damage the heavy warships. It became a war of attrition, of ramming and boarding, of fire and arrows. The sea grew choked with debris, with broken oars and shattered timbers, with bodies of the dead and dying. And then, In the early afternoon, with the battle still raging, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly turned and sailed away, heading south toward Egypt. Ancient sources debate why she did this. Some say she panicked, that she fled in cowardice. Others suggest it was a planned maneuver, that she was trying to escape a battle that was clearly going badly. The truth, lost to history, probably lies somewhere in between. Perhaps she saw that the battle was lost, that staying would only result in destruction of her fleet, and made the pragmatic decision to retreat while retreat was still possible. What is certain is that Antony, seeing her ships turning away, made a fateful decision. He abandoned his own fleet, transferred to a smaller ship, and followed Cleopatra. His officers watched in dismay as their commander sailed away. Without Antony's leadership, without any clear reason to continue fighting, the fleet surrendered. The battle was over. Octavian had won. Antony and Cleopatra reached Alexandria, but they knew their situation was desperate. They sent messages to Octavian trying to negotiate, but he was not interested in compromise. He wanted total victory, wanted Antony dead and Cleopatra captured, so he could display her in his triumph in Rome. They spent the winter of 31 to 30 BC in a strange twilight existence, knowing the end was coming, but unable or unwilling to face it directly. They dissolved the Society of Inimitable Livers and formed a new club, the Order of Those Who Will Die Together. They held banquets and parties, but now there was a desperate quality to the celebrations, a determination to enjoy what little time remained. Cleopatra tested various poisons, trying them on condemned prisoners, searching for one that would bring a quick and painless death. She made plans, gathering treasure, preparing a massive pyre. She sent Caesarion away, hoping he might escape and live to rebuild what had been lost. In August of 30 BC, Octavian's army arrived at Alexandria. Antony led his remaining forces out to meet them, but his men deserted, going over to Octavian. The navy sailed out of the harbor and surrendered without a fight. Antony returned to the palace to find Cleopatra had barricaded herself in her tomb, the monument she had built to house her body after death, along with all her treasure. Someone told Antony that Cleopatra was dead, that she had killed herself. Overwhelmed by grief and despair, Antony decided to follow her into death. He ordered his servant Eros to kill him, but Eros, unable to strike his master, killed himself instead. Antony then tried to stab himself, driving his sword into his stomach, but the wound was not immediately fatal. And then word came that Cleopatra was alive, that she was in her tomb, but had not killed herself. Antony, still alive but mortally wounded, begged to be carried to her. They brought him to the tomb, but Cleopatra would not open the doors. Instead, she and her attendants used ropes to haul the dying Antony up through a high window. Imagine that scene. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, once the most powerful woman in the world, now pulling her dying lover up through a window. Antony, the great general, bleeding and in agony, being hauled up by ropes, knowing he is dying. They brought him inside, and Cleopatra cradled him as he died. Ancient sources describe her grief, how she tore her robes and beat her breast, how she called him her lord and husband. He died in her arms, and with him died the last hope of resistance. Egypt had fallen. The Ptolemaic dynasty was over. The age of the pharaohs had come to an end. Octavian now had to deal with Cleopatra. He did not want her to kill herself. He wanted her alive, to display her in his triumph in Rome. to parade her through the streets as proof of his victory. He sent assurances that she would be treated well, but Cleopatra knew what treated well meant in Roman triumphs. She would be humiliated, displayed to jeering crowds, exhibited like an exotic animal. She negotiated for time, asking to be allowed to give Antony a proper burial. Octavian agreed. She held the funeral rites, pouring offerings, placing wreaths, speaking the ancient formulas. She mourned genuinely, for she had loved him, perhaps not with the intellectual fascination she had felt for Caesar, but with real affection, with the warmth born of shared pleasures and shared dangers. After the funeral, she returned to her palace, technically a prisoner, but still a queen, still treated with a degree of respect. Octavian visited her, curious to meet this legendary woman. Ancient sources describe their meeting. He found her aged by grief, her beauty dimmed. She was 39 years old but looked older, worn down by strain and sorrow. Yet when she spoke, something of her old charm remained. She tried to work on him as she had worked on Caesar and Antony. But Octavian was different. He was younger, colder, more calculating. He was immune to her charm because he had made himself immune. Cleopatra realized she would not win him over. She would not forge an alliance with him. He intended to take her to Rome, to display her in his triumph. She had perhaps 2 weeks before he would transport her to Italy. If she was going to escape that final humiliation, she would have to act quickly. On August 12th, 30 BC, Cleopatra asked permission to visit Antony's tomb one last time. She was allowed to go, accompanied by her 2 most faithful attendants, Iris and Charmian. At the tomb, she made offerings and spoke her farewells. Then she returned to her palace. There, she dressed in her royal regalia. She put on the robes of a pharaoh, the symbols of her divine status. She arranged herself on a golden couch, as if preparing for a formal reception. And then, somehow she died. Her 2 attendants died with her, Iris first, then Charmian, who lived just long enough to arrange Cleopatra's robes properly, before she too collapsed. When Octavian's guards entered the room, they found all 3 dead. There was no sign of violence, no blood, no obvious cause of death. The ancient sources say it was a snake, an asp, a small venomous cobra smuggled into the chamber in a basket of figs. The snake bit Cleopatra, delivering a poison that brought relatively quick death. Whether this is true, we cannot know for certain. Some modern scholars suggest other poisons, but the image of the asp became legendary, fitting for a queen who had identified herself with the goddess Isis, for whom the cobra was a sacred symbol. Octavian was furious when he heard. He had been cheated of his prize. Cleopatra had found a way to die on her own terms, as a queen of Egypt, rather than as a captive in a Roman triumph. She had made a final gesture of defiance, choosing death over humiliation, freedom over captivity. In death, she defeated Octavian, denying him the spectacle he craved. She was 39 years old, pharaoh of Egypt for 22 years, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last of the pharaohs, the last independent ruler Egypt would have for more than 2,000 years. Octavian buried her beside Antony, as she had wished. He killed Caesarion, eliminating any possible rival. But he spared Cleopatra's children by Antony, perhaps out of respect for his sister Octavia. They were taken to Rome and raised in Octavia's household, living quiet lives far from power. Egypt became a Roman province, personally controlled by Octavian, who would soon take the name Augustus. and become Rome's first emperor. The treasure of the Ptolemies was looted, shipped to Rome. The age of the pharaohs was over. The age of the emperors had begun. But while Cleopatra died, her legend lived on, growing and evolving through the centuries. Within years, stories were being told that exaggerated and distorted the truth, that transformed an intelligent, capable queen into a seductress and temptress. Roman writers portrayed her as the enemy of Rome, a scheming foreign queen who destroyed great men through sexual wiles. This image persisted for centuries. Medieval and Renaissance writers saw her as a warning about the dangers of female power. She became a symbol of exotic Eastern decadence. Painters and poets portrayed her as a beautiful temptress, luring Roman heroes to their doom. But this portrayal does Cleopatra a tremendous injustice. The real Cleopatra was far more interesting. She was not merely beautiful, she was brilliant. Ancient sources, even hostile Roman ones, acknowledge her intellectual gifts. She spoke at least 9 languages. She was educated in mathematics, philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. She was a skilled diplomat who maintained Egypt's independence during a time when most Eastern kingdoms were falling under Roman domination. She was also an effective ruler. During her reign, Egypt prospered. She managed the complex bureaucracy of the Ptolemaic state, ensured good harvests through proper maintenance of irrigation systems, maintained religious traditions that bound her people to their rulers. When she aligned herself with Caesar and then with Antony, she was not acting out of romantic infatuation, but out of calculated political necessity. She needed Roman protection. Her relationships with these men were alliances first, romances second, and even her relationships show her intelligence. She chose her partners well. She allied with the most powerful men of her age, men who could protect Egypt and advance its interests. That she also loved them, that she formed genuine emotional bonds, does not diminish the political calculation behind those relationships. Her greatest achievement was simply maintaining Egypt's independence for as long as she did. The Eastern Mediterranean was being absorbed by Rome. Kingdom after kingdom fell. Cleopatra alone managed to keep Egypt free, to maintain its status as an allied kingdom rather than a conquered province. She did this through diplomacy, strategic marriages, and by making herself indispensable to her Roman partners. When she finally lost, it was not because of any personal failing, but because the odds were too great. Octavian was a political genius. Agrippa was the finest naval commander of the age. Together, they built a machine that was unstoppable. Antony and Cleopatra could not match this combination. The defeat at Actium was decisive. Cleopatra chose to face defeat on her own terms. She died as she had lived, as a queen, making decisions, exercising agency, even in death. That final choice, to kill herself, rather than be displayed in Octavian's triumph, was perhaps her most powerful statement. It said, "I may have lost, but you cannot humiliate me. I remain to the end, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt." And in a way, she did defeat Octavian. He paraded an effigy of her in his triumph, but it was not the same. The Romans knew they were seeing a statue, not the living woman. Cleopatra had escaped, had gone somewhere Octavian could not follow. Her final image would not be of humiliation, but of dignity, of a queen on her deathbed, dressed in royal regalia, facing death with courage. Over the centuries, as historical knowledge improved, the real Cleopatra began to emerge from behind the legend. Modern historians recognize her as one of the ablest rulers of her age, male or female. She was a polyglot scholar, an effective administrator, a shrewd diplomat, a charismatic leader. She lived in dangerous times and navigated those dangers with remarkable skill, maintaining her power and protecting her kingdom for more than 2 decades. She was not perfect. She could be ruthless when necessary, probably ordering the deaths of her siblings when they threatened her power. She took enormous gambles. She misjudged situations. But she was operating with limited options, making the best choices she could. If we set aside the legends and propaganda, if we look at the evidence dispassionately, we see a remarkable woman, born into a dynasty that was already fading, ruling a kingdom increasingly overshadowed by Rome. She managed to maintain her power and Egypt's independence longer than anyone had a right to expect. She bore 4 children to 2 of the most powerful men in the world. She left a legacy that has endured for 2,000 years. She was one of the most extraordinary women in history. A queen who ruled not just through birth, but through ability. A scholar who happened to wear a crown. A woman who stood as an equal to the greatest men of her age. The fact that she ultimately lost does not diminish her achievements. She fought bravely, loved passionately, ruled wisely, and died with dignity. What more could anyone ask of a life? And so we come to the end of our journey with Cleopatra, last queen of Egypt, last of the pharaohs, last of the Ptolemies. We have walked with her from the palace of her childhood to the tomb where she died, from the banks of the Nile to the waters of Actium, from triumph to tragedy. It has been a long journey, but now it is time to rest. Let go of the story now. Let go of Cleopatra and Caesar, of Antony and Octavian, of all the players in this ancient drama. They lived and loved and struggled and died long ago. Their passions have cooled, their ambitions have crumbled to dust. Time has swept them all away, leaving only stories, only names, only the echo of lives once lived. But you are here, and now. You are warm and comfortable and safe. The ancient world is gone, but peace remains. The peace that comes with rest, with letting go, with releasing all the tensions and worries of the day. Feel that peace now, flowing through you like the Nile flowing to the sea, gentle and inevitable. Let your breathing slow. Deep breath in, slow breath out. Feel your body sinking into comfort, every muscle relaxing, every thought dissolving. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. This moment is sufficient. This peace is complete. The lotus flowers bloom on still waters. The stars shine over empty deserts. The river flows eternally toward the sea, and you drift gently, easily, towards sleep. The story is over. The day is done. All that remains is rest, blessed rest. The sleep that heals and restores and renews. Cleopatra sleeps in her tomb beside Antony, lost beneath 2,000 years of building. Somewhere in Alexandria, perhaps under the streets, perhaps under the waves. The city she loved is still there, but changed beyond recognition. And yet something remains, some memory, some whisper of the glory that once was. When the sun sets over the Mediterranean, when the waves lap against the ancient shore, you can almost hear echoes of the past, almost see the golden barges sailing. But these are distant things, dream things, fading even as we notice them. Let them fade. Let everything fade except the deep peace of this moment, the comfort of your resting place, the gentle darkness that welcomes you home. Sleep now, dear traveler. Your journey through ancient Egypt is complete. You have met the legendary queen, walked through her world, seen her triumph and her fall. And now, like her, you can rest. Not in a tomb, but in sleep. Not in death, but in the small death that precedes waking. The blessed oblivion that refreshes and restores. The Nile flows on, as it has for thousands of years, as it will for thousands more. The desert stretches endless beneath eternal stars. And you sleep, peaceful and safe, dreaming perhaps of lotus flowers and golden crowns, of queens and pharaohs, of ancient days when gods walked the earth and legends were born. Sleep well. Dream sweetly. Rest in the peace that passes understanding. The story of Cleopatra is told, but your story continues tomorrow, when you wake refreshed and renewed. For now, simply rest, simply sleep, simply let go. Good night, dear friend. May your dreams be as peaceful as the Nile at evening, as gentle as the Mediterranean breeze, as restful as the ages themselves. The last queen of Egypt has found her peace, and so shall you.